Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you all with us. This is our agenda for our time together. We'll start with some introductions. And we'll share our goals for this webinar. We'll talk about some of the purposes of professional learning evaluation. We'll then walk through a new tool we recently published that can help you evaluate your professional learning. We'll describe the evaluation process and highlight some of the key evaluation planning activities that we hope you can get started using in your own work. And finally, we'll hear from one of our partners in Connecticut who has been working with us to develop an evaluation plan for their professional learning initiative. So that you can put a face with the voices, here are the presenters you'll be hearing from today. I'm Nicole Breslow, and together with my colleague Joanna Barmore, we co-lead the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance for the REL. Georgia Bach is a researcher at REL Northeastern Islands and has been working with Joanna and me to support districts and states in evaluating their professional learning activities. And Deb Richards is joining us from the Capital Region Education Council. Deb is part of a team of partners in Connecticut we've been working with on their professional learning evaluation. She'll be sharing her experiences a little later in the workshop. The REL Northeastern Islands is one of 10 regional educational laboratories that are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. We work in partnership with educators and policymakers to develop and use research that improves outcomes for students. Our work falls into 4 categories. We conduct rigorous research studies to investigate high-priority education questions. We disseminate research findings and evidence-based tools and help stakeholders apply them to their context. We provide training and technical assistance to build capacity to use data and research. And finally, we manage research alliances and partnerships focused on regional education needs that ground all of our other work. Our goals for today are for participants to learn about the Evaluating Professional Learning tool and how you can use it in your work. We hope participants will deepen your understanding of why evaluating professional learning is important and worth investing time and resources. And finally, you'll learn about a process for evaluating professional learning that is feasible for districts and school leaders. We know many districts and schools have limited capacity to undertake evaluation, and we hope that you'll take away some ideas for how you can integrate evaluation into your work without it being too overwhelming. So before we dive into exploring the tool, we want to learn a little bit about all of you. So what experience do you have with evaluating professional learning? You all should see a poll pop up on your screen. If you could just select the option on your screen that best describes you. Are you completely new to evaluation? Are you familiar with the general process of evaluating professional learning? Do you have experience developing evaluation plans? It looks like we're fairly split here with a fairly even split among all 3, with almost half of the people on the call who are familiar with the process of evaluating professional learning. So great, that's helpful. Thank you all for completing that. We hope that no matter what your experience level is, that you'll all take away some new tools and strategies for evaluating your professional learning. So as we're talking through the evaluation process and tools, it will be really helpful for you all to have in your mind a particular professional learning initiative that you're involved in. So throughout the course of the webinar, we're going to pause along the way and ask you to think about your professional learning efforts and how the tools and process might apply to your context. So right now, I'm going to give you a minute to think about what professional learning initiative you want to focus on today. So please briefly share in the chat, just a sentence or 2, a brief description of your professional learning initiative. Thanks, Carla. She's working on a professional learning initiative around MTSS. Oh, we have another one on MTSS. Jill is working on some continuous improvement projects. see somebody's focused on literacy for early childhood educators, DEI curriculum, mathematics teaching practices. Great. So as you're all thinking about your professional learning initiative, I am going to pass this now to my colleague Georgia, who's going to share a little bit about why we should evaluate professional learning.
Thanks, Nicole. So as Nicole mentioned, there are a number of sort of reasons why we might want to conduct professional development evaluations, and so we wanted to give a quick overview of some of the reasons why you might want to do that. So oftentimes, evaluations serve an accountability function and are required by external or internal agencies as they might use them to help inform funding or policy decisions. And another reason we might want to conduct evaluations is really to look at program implementation. So you might be interested in learning about how the program is being implemented and if it's being implemented as you intended it to be. You may also be interested in tracking or monitoring the progress of your program or initiative to help you make any course corrections, identify challenges or strengths, or make any other improvements as the program is being implemented. And lastly, we all know that everyone really would love to understand more about the impact of their program. So we often conduct evaluations to do that as well. And knowing more about the program outcomes can help us make decisions about modifying, scaling up, replicating, or in some cases maybe discontinuing a program. And overall, conducting an evaluation can be a really, really worthwhile investment to help you determine the effectiveness of your program. So now that we've discussed some of the key reasons for conducting an evaluation, we want to introduce you to a simple evaluation framework for thinking about the evaluation process. So this here is a continuous evaluation model, and it might look familiar if you have used continuous improvement processes in your work before. In fact, our colleagues at the REL Northeast Islands have developed a toolkit specifically on continuous improvement, and we'll provide the link to that in the chat as well. So as we talk about the different components of our toolkit on evaluating professional learning, you'll see how the different steps here in this, this continuous evaluation model really align with the evaluation process that we've laid out in the toolkit. We also think this model is a really useful way to think about evaluation because it highlights that evaluation isn't a single event and it's not a linear process either. So thinking of evaluation in this way can help you to identify strengths and challenges in program implementation, and it can also help you to make course corrections or modifications, as I mentioned before. And thinking about evaluation as a continuous process can also help you to build a culture of data use among your team or in your organization, which can be really valuable as well. So now we'll move from thinking about evaluation more broadly to thinking specifically about evaluating professional learning. And with that, we wanted to highlight Thomas Guskey's 5 critical levels of professional development evaluation. Guskey outlines these 5 levels of data necessary for effectively evaluating professional learning. And they include participants' reactions, which is level 1, participants' learning, organizational support and change, participants' use of new knowledge and skills, and level 5, which is student learning outcomes. So each of these levels really builds on one another. So oftentimes program success at lower levels is necessary for success at higher levels. So for example, in order to see changes in student learning, we first need to see that teachers have acquired and are able to apply specific skills that are tied to those student outcomes that we hope to see. And this might seem like sort of an obvious statement, but it's really important to consider these different levels when you're planning for your evaluation, especially when developing your evaluation questions and making sure that you have questions that address each of these 5 levels. So now we'll move into talking more about our toolkit. So today we're going to be sharing an overview of the toolkit that we've developed to help schools and districts evaluate their professional learning initiatives. In addition to walking you through the different phases and steps of evaluating your professional learning initiatives, this resource also contains a number of different really user-friendly fillable worksheets for you to complete with your teams. So you can find the toolkit and all of those different fillable worksheets at the link that Nicole has shared in the chat. And so before we really dig into the different resources and pieces of the toolkit, I wanted to orient you to sort of the different key phases in the evaluation process. Phase 1 is preparing for evaluation. Phase 2 is developing strong evaluation questions. Phase 3 is developing a data collection plan. And phase 4 is making meaning of your data. So as you'll notice, these align with a number of the steps that we talked about in the continuous evaluation model. So now I'm going to turn things over to Nicole, who's going to give us an overview of phase 1 and talk about where to get started when you are wanting to do an evaluation.
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's Johanna, not me.
That's okay, Joanna here. I want to share with you all a little bit about some of the key tasks that we encourage teams to undertake during phase 1 when you're preparing for evaluation. And the first of which is designing or selecting a high-quality professional development initiative, assembling your evaluation team, creating a logic model, and describing what high-quality implementation looks like. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about each one of these in turn. So the first is about selecting or designing a high-quality professional development initiative that you want to evaluate. So that's really where you begin. And you might already have a very clearly defined initiative, but we still encourage teams to reflect on the current design of the professional learning. And we do that because we really want to make sure that the design of the professional learning really aligns with the research-based characteristics of high-quality professional development. And if we look at our professional development initiative with that lens, and we see that it does not meet many of these categories, or many of these kind of signals of high-quality professional development, then we might need to pause on the evaluation and reconsider just the overall design of the professional learning initiative before we're evaluating it. We want to make sure we're evaluating something that we have reason to believe is of high quality. And these are our guiding characteristics that you see there on the slide. The next thing you need to do is assemble an evaluation team. This might seem kind of intuitive, but it's really important to think carefully about who should be on this team. So it may include some of those that are actually working on the professional development initiative. They're probably the experts in what is trying to be accomplished with that initiative. But we also find that kind of additional expertise is really needed on that team for the evaluation to be effective. So first, the team really needs a couple of strong leaders in the district or leaders in the state or leaders in the school who can really provide both the human and financial capital that the evaluation team needs to do their job. Leaders also play a really important role in understanding who the stakeholders are in the particular evaluation and really communicating the results of that evaluation with those stakeholders. We also find that teams need to think carefully about who on the team has expertise in data collection and analysis. It's a real critical set of skills, and my professional development providers themselves or my leaders, that might not be their expertise. And so oftentimes districts or states have particular offices and personnel who may not be super knowledgeable about the professional learning, but they're really knowledgeable about how to collect, how to organize, and how to analyze data in a way that's efficient. So it's really important to have someone on the team that has that kind of expertise. Once you've got your team together, it's time to start working on your logic model. And in a lot of ways, the logic model is really one of the most impactful tasks during phase one, right? And so the logic model is going to provide a simplified picture of the relationship between the program inputs and the desired outputs of the program. What do I mean by that? Well, the logic model is going to start with your problem statement. What is the problem you are trying to solve? So many of you talked about PD around MTSS implementation, and we would start with asking ourselves, what is the problem we are trying to solve with the professional learning around MTSS? We would then ask ourselves, okay, we've gotten clear about the problem we are trying to solve. What are the resources that we have available to ourselves to actually make progress on this problem? And then what are the strategies and activities we're going to put in place to make progress on this problem? This is really, your resources are kind of the money, the people, the time, external professional development providers, and then the strategies are the actual program activities. What are the professional learning experiences folks are going to have? Is it going to be traditional PD? Is it going to be coaching? Is it going to be leadership coaching? And then we start to describe what are the outcomes that we expect from this particular professional learning initiative, both in the short term and in the long term. And one of the really important parts of the evaluation process is creating a very clear connection between how we're designing our professional learning and what our intended outcomes are. And the logic model, engaging and creating the logic model as a team, really helps the team clarify the purpose of the professional learning that you'll be engaging in. And finally, the last task in kind of preparing is really describing what high quality implementation of your professional learning looks like. This is really important because when we evaluate a professional learning initiative, we're not just concerned about the outcomes, but we're also concerned about the quality of our implementation. So for example, if we said that part of our professional learning initiative was instructional coaching, perhaps we're focused on some particular instructional practices in mathematics, and we did some whole faculty professional learning together, and then we did some instructional coaching. We want to be really clear. What does high quality instructional coaching look like? How frequently does it happen? Are there protocols we use? Are there ways that we're documenting the outcomes? Are there particular teachers we're outreaching to in order to conduct this coaching? And this matters because when we actually evaluate our professional learning, we won't just look at outcome data, but of course we will. We will also look at our implementation data because the extent to which we actually implemented it in the way we intended to might help explain or help us understand the outcomes that we had. So we really want to get really clear about what high quality implementation looks like. The slide you see on the screen is just one of many of the fillable tools that are available in the toolkit that are there to really guide your team through the process of describing high-quality implementation. So it's a tool there to increase your clarity. As Nicole said, we really wanted to help engage you in reflecting on the professional development initiative that you shared with us at the start of this. So thinking about a professional learning initiative that you are really interested in evaluating, I'd like you to just take a minute and reflect on what are the outcomes you are expecting to see as a result of this initiative. And go ahead and take a minute and put in the chat. I see lots of people are typing, so I'll give a quiet moment for people to reflect and share in the chat. Lots of folks are still typing. There's great stuff in the chat. Keep it coming. And one thing you might ask yourself, most of the outcomes folks are naming in here when we think about the GUSCI levels that Georgia spoke about in the beginning. What I'm seeing in many of the comments is about changes in teachers' practice as well as changes in outcomes for students. So you're really looking at, I believe it's level 4 and level 5 outcomes. So when I read, you would like to reduce the number of students who are at risk for reading in grades K through 3, I'm reading about an outcome for students. When I see educators are kind of early on, I think Carla said an improvement in universal Tier 1 instruction. So we want to see an improvement in our Tier 1 instruction and our teacher practice. And then I also even see that tied into the goal is to have at least 80% of our students at benchmark without additional support. So I'm seeing some connections to what you're trying to achieve with MTSS there. And so one of the parts about phase 1 is about really getting clarity on some of those outcomes. And you might also ask yourself, what are some of the intermediary outcomes that we're interested in? What are some things that we expect to happen along the way in order to see those changes in instruction, in order to see those changes in student outcomes? So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who's going to take us into phase 2.
Thanks, Joanna. So you just heard about phase 1, preparing for evaluation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about phase 2, which is developing strong evaluation questions. So in phase 2, there are 2 things that we want to think about. First, before you develop your evaluation questions, it's really important to have a clear understanding of the purpose of the evaluation and how the results will be used by different stakeholder groups. It's also helpful to align your evaluation questions with your logic model to make sure that your questions are focused on what matters most. So this is a tool that we provide that helps you This is the first tool in the stakeholder section that helps you sort of map out information about each of the stakeholder groups and consider what questions they might have and how they might use the evaluation results. So you can think about all the different stakeholder groups that might have an interest in the professional learning initiative. This includes those who are involved in implementation, like coaches and teachers and professional learning managers, but also others who might be interested, like funders, Board of Education members, and district leaders. It's important that your evaluation answer questions that matter to your stakeholders and are useful and actionable. And this also connects back to what Georgia was discussing earlier about the purposes of evaluation. So your evaluation questions will look different if your main purpose is for accountability to funders, or if it's about monitoring progress or continuous improvement. So getting clarity about why you're doing an evaluation and what you hope to get out of it is going to really help your team to develop evaluation questions that will meet your needs. This is another tool that can help you with developing strong evaluation questions. This tool asks you to look at each component of your logic model and think systematically about what you want to know about each component. So one thing that's really helpful about this approach is that it helps ensure that you have a balance of questions that focus on program implementation and program effectiveness. So questions that focus on resources, activities and strategies, and output will give you information that can inform program improvement and help you course correct during implementation. And then questions that focus on outcomes and impacts will provide information about program effectiveness. And I also want to point out that this tool asks you to prioritize your evaluation questions. It's really important to think about your capacity as a team to conduct the evaluation. There will be data constraints. Certain questions might be much harder to answer than others with the data that you have or can collect. And there are also constraints around staff time and skills. I had just answered a question in the chat about what happens if you don't have somebody on your team who has that expertise in data analysis and collection. And so that's something to really consider when you're planning out the scope of your evaluation and choosing which evaluation questions you're going to be addressing. So this is a chart that you might need to revisit when you're developing your data collection plan, just to make sure that you're not taking on too much. So we're going to pause again now and give you a few minutes to reflect on how you might use these tools in your work. So please think about your different stakeholder groups now and share one question that you would want to answer by evaluating your professional learning initiative. I see a question in the chat asking about how outcomes and impacts are different. We think of impacts as more long-term than the outcomes. So you think about short-term and medium-term outcomes, and the impacts are usually 5 years down the line at least. I'm seeing a bit of a mix of questions asking about the impact on students. And there were a couple questions as well asking about implementation fidelity, which is great. That can also help to inform implementation. I'm also seeing a mix of short-term and medium and long-term outcomes that questions might be addressing. So for example, do educators find the strategies effective to help manage stress? That might be a short-term outcome that's intended for the professional learning strategies. think I'm going to keep moving us ahead. I'm passing it now to Georgia to talk about phase 3.
Thanks, Nicole. So phase 3 is really about developing your data collection plan. So really the 3 key steps or activities that you want to think about when you're developing a data collection plan are documenting any existing data sources, identifying and addressing any gaps in your data, and pulling all of those pieces together to create a data collection plan and a calendar. So a really great place to start is to sort of ask yourself what data that you are already collecting can you use to help you answer your evaluation questions. And then once you've done this, you'll be able to identify those gaps and determine what additional data you need to collect and put those pieces together into a full evaluation plan. So this is one of the fillable tables that we have included in our toolkit. And this section of our toolkit contains a few different tables that can help you plan out your data collection activities. But this one is really first to help you and your evaluation teams to think about what data that you can leverage that you are already collecting. And this is a really key step because it can help you to reduce the burden of having to collect new data or develop new data collection instruments. Nicole and Johanna also had mentioned capacity, and I think Lorette had a great question about that as well. So if you have existing data sources that you can use, this can really help you again, like I said, reduce the burden on having to create new instruments or identify new data sources. So we suggest by doing a bit of a brain dump with your evaluation team on the different data sources that you are already have access to or different data that you are already collecting. So some examples of this might be like classroom observations for your teachers, or professional learning logs or records, or even things like attendance sheets for a workshop that you could leverage to answer some of your evaluation questions. And so once you've brainstormed all of these different data sources, we ask you to start thinking more about how each piece of information is currently being used and which of your evaluation questions it could answer. And this will really help you transition into thinking about what format your data is in and where you might need to collect some additional data to answer any unanswered evaluation questions. And so this next table brings us to the steps of addressing any gaps in your data and creating a data collection plan. Similar to the last one, this table really prompts your team to think about what data you need to collect to answer your evaluation questions. So think about what evaluation questions you aren't able to answer with your existing data. And think about your priorities for collecting new data. And again, being mindful of what capacity your team has for collecting new data. This is also another really good place to think about Guskey's 5 levels to make sure that you have data sources and questions that address each of those 5 levels. And in our work, we've found this process to be really crucial for teams because it helps them to think about what they have the capacity to do, and it really helps them to go back to their logic model and their evaluation questions and make sure that they have a feasible plan. And in reality, this is an iterative process, and it can be a little bit messy, and that's okay. And it's really helpful to involve a number of different members on your team so that everyone can have a shared understanding about what the data collection plan will look like. And oftentimes we're really ambitious when we create our evaluation questions. And so we might decide to cut out some of the evaluation questions or refine them, or decide that one source of data is a higher priority than another. And filling out this table can really help you get clear about what it takes to answer each of these evaluation questions and revise your evaluation plan. Oh, okay. So I think we are going to do another chat here. So if you could all please share a data source that you might use to evaluate your professional learning initiative. I'm seeing classroom observations as one. That's great. Teacher unit lesson plans. Participant surveys. Absolutely. So if you have existing surveys, those can be really great tools to leverage because surveys can take a lot of time and energy and capacity to create. Yes, Nicole says bonus points if you pick a data source that might address the evaluation question that you put in the chat earlier. I'm also seeing student work, benchmark testing. Those are great data sources that you might be able to leverage. Interviews with lead organization administrators. That's great. And it's really excellent to include a mixture of qualitative and quantitative sources as well, because that can help you answer different parts of your evaluation questions and really help you dig into the hows and the whys of your program implementation and outcomes. See just a couple more people typing. I'll see if I can wait for a few more answers before I move things to the next phase. These are some great data sources. Yep, I'm seeing more student work, teacher surveys, learning walk. Those are great examples. So again, I'm going to pass things over to Joanna, who is going to talk us through phase 4.
Thank you, Georgia. So you've prepared for your evaluation, you've developed strong evaluation questions, you've got a data collection plan. I'm going to talk about phase 4, which is what you do once you've collected that data and making meaning of your data. There are really 4 key tasks in phase 4. The first is learn about the data analysis process, make sense of your data with a roadmap, use a collaborative protocol to analyze your data, and then craft and communicate your data story. So I want to start with thinking about the data analysis process itself. And this step is pretty flexible. You might have a team that are pretty novice at this kind of evaluation, or you might have a team that's quite expert at doing evaluation. And so, you know, the more expert your team, the lighter touch you need on this step. But if you have a team that's a little more novice, it's important to really spend some time making sure folks are clear on this 6-step process. So first, we go back to revisiting our evaluation question. We set that in phase 2, but now once we've actually collected the data, it's time to say what were the questions we were trying to answer, and then review the data that's relevant to those questions. That's about giving your team focus as you analyze the data. In step 3, you're going to organize and analyze the data. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but raw data is generally really hard for folks to process, so we need to do some level of organizing and analyzing before we really take a deep dive into it. Then we want to summarize the data and what we're learning from it, then interpret it in terms of making meaning of it about what worked and didn't work in our evaluation, and then decide what we're going to do next. That ACT phase, it's really important. I want to give a quick call back to what Georgia said in the beginning about understanding the purpose of your data, right? Is this about learning about what works and doesn't work in terms of PD in your context? Is it about accountability to an external funder or other source? And that really is going to shape what kind of actions you take based on this data analysis in terms of what was the original purpose of your evaluation to begin with. So I want to talk a little bit about making sense of your data with a roadmap. As I said before, when analyzing the data, we really want to begin with considering our evaluation questions in relationship to the data that we have collected. And as Georgia said, teams often collect both quantitative data, what percent of our students are proficient, what percent of our students require intervention, what percentage of teachers were enacting a particular instructional routine, but also qualitative data. What are teachers saying about the impact of the professional development? What are students saying about their sense of belonging in school? More qualitative data around folks' perceptions of things. And so we often kind of recommend that steps 3 and 4 might be a little bit different for quantitative data than it is for qualitative data, right? Because the way we analyze quantitative data might be about, descriptive statistics, or what's the mean or the median or the mode or the range. We might look at frequencies. How often did we see classrooms that UDL was being implemented during our walkthrough? Those kind of things that can be represented with numbers. And so that process might look a little different than our qualitative data. Say we did a survey of our families around family engagement, and we want to understand what our families saying are supportive aspects of family engagement in our school. Then we would be really kind of thematically organizing families' written responses to that. That wouldn't be quantitative, and trying to take out patterns and themes. So we sometimes do a little bit different in our quantitative analysis than our qualitative analysis. And just a call back again to what both Nicole and Georgia have emphasized, the grain size is important here. There's often more maybe than we want to answer than we have the capacity to answer together. So we might be thinking about what is a reasonable amount of data analysis for our team to be able to do based on our capacity and our current skills with data analysis. Then you're going to move to actually interpreting your data and making an action plan. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So we often recommend, actually I want to make one more quick point here. We often recommend that steps 1 through 4, looking at the questions, reviewing the data, organizing, analyzing, and summarizing it with some really well-chosen charts and graphs, are done by maybe just a few people on the team. So if you have a larger evaluation team, a couple of leaders with some good data analysis skills does the first pass at representing the data for their team, and then we all come together to interpret the data, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So this is really step 5 when we're interpreting the data. And when we interpret the data, we really want that to be a larger team coming together to look at the data together, to review it, to predict what they expect to see in the data, to examine the data, ask them questions, really observe. And when I say observe, I mean factual statements without judgment before we move to interpretation about what patterns or hypotheses we have about what we see in the data, and then identify lessons learned and implications for next steps. The reason why we suggest, it's important that this be a larger team, because lots of different perspectives matter in terms of analyzing your data, but also that really organizing the data ahead of time is going to be important for this collaborative data protocol. We don't want people looking at large spreadsheets of data. We want them looking at organized representations of the data in order to make sense of it together. And you'll be surprised that different stakeholders in your evaluation team will see different things in that data. The last thing we want to do, and this is really important, craft and communicate your data story. So this is where we go back to who were the stakeholders that we originally identified and what were the evaluation questions they were really concerned with, and how can we tell our story around this professional learning and the impact it's had to our various stakeholders. And so you'll see here it's another tool that's included in the toolkit about helping guide your team through the process of identifying these target audiences, identifying what they need to know, and how they will use the information and the best way to communicate with them. For example, your school board might be very interested in a particular impact of your professional learning. Your actual teachers in your district might be interested in something else. Your families might be interested in something else. So getting really clear on who are the stakeholders that we need to communicate with, how they really, what they really want to learn, and how we're going to communicate with them. So I want to take a moment, because those were the 4 phases for you: getting ready for evaluation, developing those strong evaluation questions, developing a data collection plan, and making meaning of your data. We'd really like to invite you in the chat again to share one aspect of the evaluation process you think would really benefit your professional learning initiative. And then also, this is a great opportunity for you all to ask the burning questions you have, and we will weave those in a minute when we move to talking about our speaker. And I see a few people in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, Deb, making meaning of the data is usually really powerful. We think data speaks for itself, but it really doesn't. Really looking at it together and making sense of it together is hugely impactful. And yeah, Carla, the evaluation questions is fascinating, because what you soon find is folks might have different ideas about why we're doing this professional learning and what we're trying to learn about it. So that can be really powerful to get everyone on the same page as well. Yeah, I see Will's attending to the strong evaluation questions as well. It really gets people to think about what's being done and why. Yes, it does, for sure. I see some call out to the collaborative protocols as well. We really want to make sure everyone is tied into this together. The evaluation questions really also link nicely to the logic model in terms of, what is the logic of this professional learning initiative, but also what are we trying to learn from it. And please, this is a great time for you all to start chatting in. Thank you for sharing the things that would benefit your team. But can you also put in whatever burning questions you might have that you'd like to hear us speak to more as we move to the speaker presentation portion. See a couple more people are typing. I'll give you a minute. Large team gathered to observe and interpret the data can be hugely impactful. Yeah, the prep for the evaluation needs an upgrade. What we find, Gloria, is that as part of the evaluation process, just in preparing for it, we actually end up strengthening the professional learning, because it makes us really think through what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it. And that, by definition, helps us reconsider what we're doing and why. In a second, we're going to move to invite Deb Richards to introduce herself and share her experience leading a group through this kind of evaluation. Please, as we move to this portion, go ahead and please continue to share your questions or comments or even like healthy skepticism in the chat, and we can continue to try to address and grapple with some of the challenges you might experience. Hey, Deb, I think I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience working through this project. We have kind of a unique perspective in that I work for a regional education service center in Connecticut, or referred to as a RESC. And we, along with our state education resource center, provide a lot of professional development on behalf of our State Department of Education, particularly the Bureau of Special Education. So we've been working through this process with our State Department partners, actually, as we were getting ready to frame a fairly large initiative. And the initiative, just to kind of give you a sense of what it was about, had to do with the education of students with significant disabilities being educated in general education settings, or at least restrictive environment in special ed terms, LRA. And this was a pretty high stakes initiative because we had previously had a class action lawsuit in the state around this very issue. So we had a very specific training and technical assistance model that both organizations were using to provide the training. And when we started, what we thought we wanted to do, and still was a piece of what we wanted to measure, was really the fidelity of our implementation of the training, that both organizations were staying true to this model and we were providing high quality training and technical assistance. And although that was our mindset as the trainers, if you will, on behalf of the department working with districts, we really also needed to answer the question, even if we maintain the fidelity of the training that we were providing, again, what impact did it have on students? And in the past, our primary measure of impact really was state education data that the state collects on an annual basis as part of their IDEA responsibilities. So they collect data on the time students with disabilities spend with non-disabled peers. But as we all know, that kind of high-level annual data, one often is too old by the time it's turned around and you can analyze it to kind of change your practice and inform your practice. And often it also doesn't change as quickly as day-to-day data collection that we were using, but not necessarily analyzing and collecting. So although we thought we originally wanted to demonstrate the training was of high quality, we really needed to go beyond teachers were satisfied with the training, they thought they got a lot out of it, to linking our actual training and technical assistance to the students' outcomes. And that way we could also use that information to determine, as we all know, professional development, the biggest challenge is the amount of time that people have to dedicate to it. So we don't want to be spending time with training and technical assistance that isn't helpful, and we wanted to spend our time analyzing what was most helpful about the training and technical assistance we were going to provide. Oops, one too far, hold on. So one of the lessons we learned in going through the process, we started with the logic model, which I agree is very helpful. In some respects, that was a little easier for us, particularly the beginning of the logic model where we looked at resources, strategies, and outputs, because we had designed that all around what the training and technical assistance was going to be. And we struggled more with the short-term and long-term, what those outcomes were going to be. But what I think was really most helpful for us was going to that next step of looking at the evaluation questions we wanted answered. So collaboratively doing that with both training partners and the State Department really helped us then go back and flesh out the logic model, short and long-term outcomes much more once we looked at the questions. And what we realized is we really came up with like 3 primary areas of questions that we wanted to answer. Certainly was the original question we had, which was the quality of our training and the fidelity of the delivery. But then there were the group of questions that had to do with the experience, the student outcomes, and not only the amount of time they were spending in general ed classrooms, but also looking at the quality of time in general ed classrooms. Were kids sitting in the back of the classroom with a paraprofessional, or were they really integrated into the classroom fully? And the third one really had to do with outcomes for the adults, both for the professionals, the teachers, so teacher attitude about having students in their classroom, but also parents' attitudes about wanting their child in a classroom or feeling their child was more included as part of the general student population. So we really came up with questions in those 3 areas. And we actually realized we had a fair amount of existing tools that we were collecting some of that data. You know, we had done classroom observations, we had some attitude surveys, we had done some interviews, but what we weren't doing was collecting all that information and analyzing it from a perspective of, rather than just in this school or just in this district, as an initiative as a whole, how successful were we being with really changing the trajectory of what was happening in the state. So that was like a big aha for us. And then also, as we got to the different questions we were talking about, we realized we didn't necessarily have the right people around the table. We had the people who were providing the training because in our mind, initially that's what we were focusing on, the fidelity and the implementation of the training, but we really needed to bring more data people, both from our RESC Alliance and from the State Department, so they could assist us with what's the best way for us to gather all that data from the individual schools and districts and then move forward to analyze it. So we had to kind of rethink who was on the evaluation team that we had put together when we started. Some of the other things that we learned, in this case actually COVID worked in our favor because it delayed the start of the training initiative, and to work through this process took us longer than we expected. So in our case, we actually got to the point where we're going to flesh out the entire model before we even start, which will be really helpful because now we know what we want to start gathering as baseline data before we go in and start looking at where we're going to start in providing the training and technical assistance. And also some of the other things that we thought is, you know, we really need to, on a regular basis, start building this process into every initiative that we're going to move forward before we start. So as we're developing our training plans, if you will, and what services are we going to be delivering for training and technical assistance, it also should include the time that it's going to take to dedicate resources to make sure that we really are providing not only the services we said we would deliver, but the actual measurement that we can assist our State Department colleagues with using beyond the data that they really collect on a, you know, on an ongoing basis because of their contractual responsibilities and requirements from the federal government. So we've really had to work with our state partners to say, this is part of the expectation you should have of us. It was kind of a learning process for all of us of how we should enter into this work. And one of the things, just I guess a final comment I have, and you know, everybody right now is dealing with this issue at the district level and at the state level with this, you know, really large influx of federal funds that are coming in, and the concerns people have about how are we going to spend that money, how are we going to spend it wisely. And when I think about using a model like this as we're moving forward with what people are saying this might be a 1 or a 2-year training initiative because we have the funds right now, this would be a great way if you needed to demonstrate to a school board or some other funders that, you know, we had some funds to provide some additional services and we were able to determine which of those were really successful, and we should be reallocating our resources to continue doing some of the things the current federal funds are allowing us to do. So I think this whole process is particularly pertinent right now for school districts as they think about how they're using what may be one-time resources, using them well to both build capacity, but to measure what's really helpful and effective for them. So I'll stop there, and I think we'll turn it over to folks for questions, if people have any questions for me.
Thanks so much, Deb. Your point about how timely this is right now with just the influx of resources is such an important one. We welcome you all to put any questions you have about the toolkit or about Deb's experience in the chat. We have some time for Q&A. Joanna, I wonder if you might share your response to Lorette's question.
Yeah, I think Lorette's asking a really good question around capacity at a few different levels, right? I think capacity is first about do we have the skills to be able to do this evaluation, right? Do we have the data analysis skills? Do we have the data design skills? I think capacity is also a question about time. I think you all know, especially in schools and districts, we are always short on time. And so my kind of like thinking about this is about being realistic in your context. There's a huge benefit to evaluating your professional learning. And I don't think I need to get too on the soapbox about that, but we invest a ton of money in our professional learning in schools. And so knowing whether or not what we are spending our scarce resources on is having impact in the way we want it to is really going to help us figure out how to do that work better in the future. So that's just a little call out of like, yes, there's a capacity issue, but yes, there's also like this really important reason to do this work. And so in terms of capacity, I think my advice would be about starting small, right? So start small in terms of like being realistic about your evaluation questions and being realistic about your your data collection capacity and evaluation capacity. And if you start small as you learn the process, you are going to be developing the capacity of the people that are with you so that you can start to scale up over time, and you are going to find out what it really takes to do this work so that you can start to embed it in how you think about engaging in any kind of professional learning. So it is really easy. I think Deb said this and other people said it before, to put everything in the kitchen sink in terms of your evaluation questions. But at the very beginning, you really get clear about what is really our priority and how can we keep the scale of this small in the beginning as we learn about our capacity, then completing a whole cycle is more important than feeling like you need to cover everything you could possibly cover. Nicole and Georgia, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would just add to that that I think it's okay to sort of revise your evaluation plan and your evaluation questions at various points during the process. You don't need to start out by thinking that you have to answer all of the questions that you initially developed. You know, again, we just want to emphasize that this is really a continuous improvement process, and so it is okay to revisit those and check your capacity and sort of revise based on what's realistic for you and your team.
Nicole, I'd like to respond to the question in the chat about resistance to collecting data. I think one of the things that we've learned is sometimes the resistance to collecting data is one, you collect data and you don't use it, so are you collecting data? That's a waste of my time. Or you collect data and people are concerned that it's going to be used against them, you know, and I think we had an era of data being used to label schools and target schools and districts. So there is some skepticism about collecting data. And I think the best thing that we've done is we've explained to people why the data is important. And from a professional development perspective, you know, one of the data points we're collecting is what's called the school practice profile. So schools are going through and doing some analysis of their data, but we tell them this is really important because this will let us customize what we are going to do in professional development to meet your needs. So we're going to find out if you're really good at something, we're not going to waste time on that. But if your teachers all identify this as an area of need, or we see that as a general challenge for you, then we're going to get in there and provide you resources and technical assistance to address what's meaningful to you. So I think a lot of it really has to do with framing the purpose of the data collection and what's going to happen to it in order for people to buy in and see it as something useful from their perspective, not just from, oh, we want to make sure that, you know, we're making progress for kids. So that's been really helpful to us.
That's a great point, Deb. And just to add on to that, I think it's also helpful if it's teachers who are being resistant to include them up front in some of the earlier phases of this work. So bringing them on board to help develop the logic model and help identify evaluation questions and develop the data collection plan. Having all of these different stakeholders involved, I think, can be helpful in getting the full team and all the different stakeholders to really have ownership over the evaluation, and I think also just in terms of communicating to the whole group to be able to help them understand why, you know, the purpose for needing to collect the data. And that can also be helpful. All right, it seems like questions are winding down in the chat. Last chance. Well, we really thank you for your engagement. And if other questions come up, or if you begin to work through this toolkit and find that you get stuck, we invite you to reach out to us. We are offering 30-minute consultations with our team, and Georgia is going to put the link in the chat where you can sign up. And if you just want a thought partner or want feedback on some of the things that you're doing to evaluate your professional learning, we're happy to provide that support. We can clarify anything in the toolkit, help troubleshoot a challenge you're facing, any of those things. So please feel free to sign up, and we'd be happy to kind of dig in more specifically to the challenges that you're facing in your context. So thank you all for your participation today. We are winding down a little bit early, giving you back a little bit of time. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and we ask that you please complete the survey that's going to automatically pop up right in your window. So thanks again for joining us